The Second World War is typically remembered as a conflict defined by tanks, aircraft, naval power, and the courage of soldiers on the front line. But Europe, of course, and Britain in particular, fought another war. One far from the trenches, waged across its fields, hillsides, and reclaimed marshes. And this was the war for food, fuel, and of course materials, raw materials, and it proved just as vital to national survival as any military campaign. When Britain entered the war in 1939, it relied heavily on imports for food supply. Roughly 70% of all essential foodstuffs came from abroad, along with timber, oils, and industrial raw materials. The German U-boat blockade sought to choke off those supplies and starve the population into submission. Britain quickly found itself confronted, by looming crisis of how to keep 48 million people fed, while also supplying raw materials, factories, and explosives, and keeping that front line fed. Hello, everybody. You're very welcome back to the channel. I know this video is very heavily weighted towards the British end of the conflict during World War II, and the vital and crucial part that farm machinery, tractors in particular, and of course the women and the younger people, of course, of the time, who played a vital role in keeping food coming, keeping raw materials coming, the likes of flax and oil seeds and stuff for lubricants, oils, and stuff that was vital that you wouldn't have thought was vital during the war. And of course, us too here in Ireland, we did rely heavily on foods from Britain, and of course we did, whether we like to admit it or not, we did rely on the British keeping the Germans at bay, and of course keeping them from the British mainland. And of course, if they got to the British mainland, Ireland was going to be the obvious next target. So yeah, we all had a vested interest in what was going on in the UK at the time. So into the crisis, stepped an unexpected hero, and that of course was the tractor. The humble farm tractor, which had become increasingly common during interwar years, suddenly became a strategic tool. It enabled Britain to increase food production, reclaim unusable land, harvest essential raw materials, and support the industrial war machine. More importantly, tractors allowed fewer workers to produce more food at a time when men were leaving farms for the military and for the front line. The tractor was not simply a machine of convenience, it became a weapon of survival. Its role in securing Britain's food supply and supporting wartime industry makes it one of the unsung heroes of the Allied victory. So at the onset of the war, at the outset of the war, Britain was dangerously vulnerable. Agricultural production had declined steadily since the First World War, as cheap imported grain had caused many farms to downsize or shift to livestock. Horses still outnumbered tractors on British farms, and vast areas of land had gone uncultivated for years. As German submarines began sinking merchant ships, Britain was losing nearly 1 million tonnes of imported food per month. The Ministry of Agriculture, recognising the severity of the crisis, launched a massive initiative known as the War Agricultural Executive Committee, or simply the War Ags. Their mission was to transform British farming from a traditional system into a fully mechanised industrial output machine. To accomplish this transformation, tractors were essential. The horse could plough roughly, an acre a day, and tractor could plough between 5 and 10 acres a day, depending on the conditions. This multiplication of output was the difference between starvation and, of course, survival. As a result, the government began a national campaign to acquire tractors. Some were built domestically, but many were imported from the United States and Canada under the early Lend-Lease agreements, the Fordson Model N and the Allis-Chalmers WC, and later the Massey Harris and Case models. They became the backbone of Britain's mechanised farming effort. These tractors arrived by sea at great risk, with some convoys suffering heavy U-boat losses in the Atlantic Ocean. Every tractor that arrived and survived the Atlantic crossing was treated as a strategic resource. By 1940, Britain had doubled its national tractor fleet. By 1943, the fleet had nearly tripled, with over 100,000 tractors in active service, many of them operated by women and children. So, one of the defining features of wartime agriculture was the sudden change in who worked the land. Millions of men between the ages of 18 and 41 were conscripted, leaving farms severely understaffed. Without labour, even the most powerful tractors would just sit idle. To solve the labour shortage, the government expanded the Women's Land Army, the WLA. These women, often from urban backgrounds, they were trained to operate tractors, lorries, threshing machines, balers, cultivation equipment, their impact could not be overstated. The tractor gave the Women's Land Army the power to do the work of multiple horse teams of several farmhands. Many had, never driven a car before. Within weeks they were ploughing fields and they were servicing engines and performing heavy mechanical tasks. Their efficiency was so high that in 1944, the WLA tractor drivers were responsible for preparing up to 1/3 of Britain's arable land. The tractor changed farming from a labour-intensive skill to a mechanised process. With proper training, one could, now accomplish tasks previously impossible without teams of workers. It also made impossible the cultivation of land previously considered too heavy or too marshy or too demanding for horses. Entire new landscapes were brought into production because the tractor allowed it. The British government's directive was clear: every available acre must be made productive. This became known as the Ploughing Up Campaign, an effort to convert millions of acres of grassland, rough pasture and underdeveloped terrain into productive cropland. Horses could not manage this job. Much of the land was too dense, root-filled, or even, or uneven for animal traction. Tractors made it possible though. Deep ploughing, mechanical subsoiling, powered drainage equipment allowed farmers to reclaim land that had been untouched for decades. The fens of East Anglia, for example, they saw extensive mechanical drainage and became one of Britain's most productive agricultural zones at the time. Heavy caterpillar tractors, built originally for industrial use, were even employed to clear forests and break up old peatlands. By 1943, Britain had increased its cultivated land by over 6 million acres. This expansion allowed the country to not only maintain food supplies, but to develop a surplus in several key crops, including potatoes, barley and oats. These surpluses fed both civilian population and the armed forces, relieving pressure on shipping lanes and reducing the risk of famine. This machine-led revolution was one of the greatest agricultural transformations in British history. But food was not the only concern. The war demanded vast quantities of industrial raw materials like oils, lubricants, explosive ingredients, fibres and of course animal fodder. Tractors were critical, of course, in boosting production of these materials as well. So crops like linseed, flax, rapeseed, they all expanded dramatically. These crops produced oils used in machinery lubrication, aviation fuel additives, soap, paint and waterproofing compounds. Tractors enabled timely sowing and harvesting of these labour-intensive plants. Forestry operations relied on tractors fitted with winches, towing equipment to haul felled trees. Timber was essential for railways, pit props in coal mines and military construction and ammunition crates. Caterpillar tractors allowed deep woodland access that horses and trucks could not manage. Sugar imports were heavily restricted. Britain increased sugar beet acreage significantly. And tractors allowed that, rapid planting and cultivating over large areas. Sugar beet provided sugar for civilians, of course, glucose for industrial fermentation, and byproducts for, of course, livestock feed. Looking at the fibre crops then, so, flax was needed for rope and for webbing, parachutes, of course, and harnesses and glider components. Tractors prepared the heavy soils in which, of course, flax thrived. Certain crops such as oil seeds and grains played roles in production of glycerol and ethanol, precursors for explosives. Without mechanical farming, producing these inputs would have been impossible at the required scale that was needed. Those tractors not only fed the nation, they fed the factories, they fed the Air Force, the Navy and the war machine itself. Mechanization did more to increase output. It changed how the countryside functioned. Tractors pulled trailers, to move supplies, hauled manure, transported harvested crops, delivered materials to factories and to ports, and their ability to operate in mud and poor conditions made them far more reliable than trucks. The need to maintain thousands of machines led to rapid improvements in rural mechanical skills. Farm workers and land girls learned engine servicing, welding and breakdown repairs. Rural engineering firms expanded and farmers became adept mechanics. This mechanical competency had long-term benefits. It increased wartime reliability. It created a skilled workforce ready to support post-war reconstruction. It formed the foundation of Britain's post-war agricultural boom. And not just the agricultural boom, but of course the industrial boom as well, because we have spoken at length, of course, on many occasions on this channel when we look at various different models throughout the years on factories that have been born out of that mechanization that was learned, the skills, the machinery that was involved, the factories that were used during the war. they were used for other purposes, of course, when the war had finished. And a lot of it, a vast majority, I would say, was in, the construction of trucks and tractors, farm machinery equipment. The skills were put to great use. So petrol was tightly rationed, but many tractors ran on paraffin or kerosene, which was more readily available. The Fordson Model N was specifically prized for its ability to run on low-grade fuel, making it indispensable in the war effort. As the war continued, standardization of parts and models ensured fast repairs, and it reduced downtime. The tractor out of action for a day meant acres lost at a time when every acre mattered. The impact of tractors on wartime output was staggering. In 1944, Britain produced nearly 90% of its own food needs, over 2 million acres of potatoes, record levels of home-produced wheat and barley, surpluses in several key crops, and vast increases in the production of industrial raw materials. The risk of famine, genuine in 1940, had effectively disappeared by 1943. This domestic stability allowed Britain to keep its population healthy, supply troops and with high-calorie rations, free shipping space for military hardware instead of food, and maintain civilian morale throughout the war. Churchill himself, in private correspondence, acknowledged that domestic food security was one of the pillars of Britain's endurance. It prevented capitulation during the darkest years of the war. The tractor fleet, the farmers, the land army, they were instrumental in this outcome. While tanks and Spitfires faced the enemy directly, tractors ensured that the nation behind them stood firm. The story of the Second World War cannot be told only through battles and military strategies. It must also include the thousands of women and men, and children of course, who worked Britain's fields and the machines that gave them the power to sustain a nation. Tractors transformed British agriculture from an outdated horse-reliant system into a modern, mechanised engine of productivity. They multiplied the area a single worker could cultivate, they reclaimed millions of acres, they ensured food security, supplied raw materials for factories, supported forestry and fuel production, enabled the workforce of women to replace conscripted men, and allowed Britain to outlast the U-boat threat. The tractor was, in many ways, one of Britain's most important wartime machines, not glamorous, not celebrated, and rarely mentioned in military histories, but of course it was essential. Its rumble across the fields was as vital to victory as the roar of an aircraft over the skies. In the quiet forests of the countryside, tractors played a pivotal role in winning a global conflict. Britain survived because its farms were mechanised, its land was reclaimed, and its people were fed. The tractor made that possible, and for that reason, it deserves recognition as one of the unsung heroes of the Second World War. That's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, that little rundown on the importance of the tractor during that pivotal time in the 1940s. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you've learned something out of it. Hope you enjoyed the videos and the little pictures that I sourced to go along with it. To everyone who watched, if you're still watching, thank you very much, and I will see everybody very soon. Thank you.